November 13th, 1942. Iron Bottom Sound, off Guadalcanal. The night smells of fuel oil and cordite. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, Imperial Japanese Navy, grips the cold steel railing on the bridge wing of the heavy cruiser Hiei as the darkness ahead erupts with muzzle flashes. Searchlights stab across the water, briefly illuminating American warships at point-blank range, far closer than anyone had planned. This was supposed to be a decisive surface action. Instead, it has become chaos. Shells crash into the sea around the cruiser, towering plumes of water hammering the hull. Nakamura feels the deck shudder as a 5-inch shell slams into the superstructure. Another follows, and another. The impacts are sharp, metallic, not the deep, catastrophic blows of heavy guns, but something else. Smaller, repeated. Minor hits, an officer nearby mutters. Nothing serious. Nakamura nods instinctively. Japanese doctrine teaches him that a warship lives or dies by armor and firepower. If the magazines are intact and propulsion remains, the ship will fight on. Damage control is not ignored, but it is not central. Crews are trained to fight, not to save the ship after it has been wounded. Below decks, sailors scramble to report damage. Fires break out where electrical cables have been severed. Steam lines rupture. Water begins to seep through ruptured fittings. Nothing looks fatal. Yet, across the Sound, American destroyers, smaller, lightly armored, supposedly fragile, are being hit too. Nakamura watches one of them vanish behind smoke and flame, convinced it must be finished. But minutes later, it is still moving, still firing, still there. He frowns. In the early months of the Pacific War, Japanese naval planners had studied American ships carefully. On paper, U.S. destroyers and cruisers seemed inferior, thin-skinned, crowded with equipment, full of flammable wang and fuel lines. Japanese officers joked that American ships were floating factories, cluttered and vulnerable. What they underestimated was what happened after the first hit. On board the Hiei, damage reports begin to stack up. Fires are spreading faster than expected. Communications fail intermittently. Steering grows sluggish. A shell detonates near the bridge, killing officers and spraying fragments through exposed compartments. Still, no single blow seems decisive. But the ship is bleeding. Down below, there are no organized repair parties moving in practiced patterns. Sailors attempt to fight fires with what equipment is nearby. Orders overlap. Confusion spreads in the dark, smoke-filled compartments. Flooding is countered piecemeal, not systematically. Nakamura overhears a senior officer say something that chills him more than the gunfire. "Once we disengage," the officer says, "we will assess damage properly." Once we disengage. The Americans, he realizes, are doing the opposite. A U.S. Navy destroyer, later identified as USS Laffey, takes hit after hit at close range. Japanese gunners cheer when shells strike home. Flames engulf the superstructure. Anyone watching would swear the ship is doomed. But below decks, something very different is happening. American sailors, many of them barely out of training, are moving automatically. Fire teams seal compartments without waiting for orders. Flooding parties counterflood to stabilize the ship. Electrical crews reroute power around damaged circuits. Medical teams establish triage stations in passageways already slick with water and oil. No one debates whether the ship can be saved. They assume it must be. The result is not invincibility, but survival. Laffey staggers away from the fight, burned, shattered, nearly unrecognizable, but afloat. Back aboard Hiei, the situation deteriorates by the minute. The cruiser's rudder jams. Fires rage unchecked in several compartments. Ammunition hoists fail. Attempts to isolate flooding come too late. Watertight doors are not uniformly sealed, and damage control teams lack centralized coordination. Nakamura feels the list begin, slight at first, then unmistakable. "This ship has suffered too many small wounds," someone says quietly. The phrase lingers in the air. Too many small wounds. Not one killing blow. By dawn, Hiei is a cripple. American aircraft circle overhead as the sun rises. Bombs and torpedoes strike an already wounded ship. The crew fights desperately to keep her alive, but the battle has already been decided, not by the final attacks, but by the hours before, when damage spread faster than it could be contained. Nakamura abandons ship with the others, watching the proud cruiser settle lower in the water. He does not understand yet what truly killed her. He only knows that the Americans, who had seemed so fragile, lost ships slowly, while Japan's lost them suddenly. In Tokyo, initial reports frame the battle as a tactical mishap. Night fighting had been confused. American resistance was stubborn. Losses were regrettable. But beneath the official language, unease spreads. Why did American ships absorb punishment and remain in action? Why did Japanese ships, seemingly less damaged, succumb so quickly afterward? Some officers dismiss the question. "American ships are expendable," one planner scoffs. "They build many. We build better." But the men who were there, men like Nakamura, are not so sure. They remember the fires that spread unchecked, the flooding that could not be contained, the absence of drilled responses once the first shell hit. They begin to suspect that the battle was not decided by gunnery or courage alone. It was decided by what happened after the damage, and that realization, still unspoken, will haunt every major naval engagement that follows. December 1942, Tokyo Naval Staff College. The room is warm, orderly, confident. Captain Shigeru Takeda, Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, listens as a junior officer presents a summary of recent surface engagements around Guadalcanal. Slides are flipped, charts displayed, tonnage lost, enemy losses estimated, tactical conclusions drawn. No one mentions damage control. Not directly. When Takeda raises the issue, it is almost as an afterthought. "Our cruisers," he says carefully, "appear to be lost after disengagement. Not during decisive moments of battle." A few officers nod, others look impatient. One rear admiral responds with a thin smile. That is the nature of naval warfare. Once a ship is crippled, her fate is sealed. Takeda does not argue. Open disagreement would be pointless. The doctrine is deeply ingrained. Ships are instruments of offense. Victory comes from striking first, striking hard, and destroying the enemy before he can respond. Damage control is defensive, and defense in Japanese naval culture is a lesser virtue. This attitude did not arise from ignorance. Japanese naval architects built some of the most powerful warships afloat. Fast, heavily armed, optimized for decisive engagements. Their crews were superbly trained in gunnery, navigation, night fighting. The assumption was simple. A well-fought battle would not require prolonged survival under fire. If a ship took multiple hits, something had already gone wrong. Across the Pacific, the Americans were operating under a very different assumption. At Pearl Harbor, San Diego, and Norfolk, U.S. Navy crews trained relentlessly in damage control, not as a secondary skill, but as a core competency. Sailors drilled with hoses and shoring timbers as often as they drilled with guns. Compartments were labeled, procedures standardized, responsibilities drilled into muscle memory. Every sailor knew how to fight a fire. Every sailor knew how to stop flooding. Not because it was heroic, but because it was expected. January 1943, South Pacific. A U.S. cruiser takes a torpedo hit during a night action. The blast tears open compartments, kills dozens, and knocks out power in several sections of the ship. For a moment, the vessel lurches dangerously. Japanese observers later assume the ship must have sunk. It does not. Within minutes, emergency power is restored. Flooding is contained by counter-flooding planned long before the war began. Fires are isolated by trained teams who seal compartments without waiting for orders. The ship limps away, but she limps away alive. Back in Tokyo, Takeda reads intercepted reports with growing unease. American ships are not invulnerable, but they are stubborn. The difference lies not in courage. Japanese sailors are brave, often extraordinarily so. They fight fires until smoke overwhelms them. They remain at their posts until ordered to abandon ship, sometimes too late. But bravery without structure bleeds time, and time is everything after a hit. March 1943, Bismarck Sea. Japanese transports are shredded by American air attack. Bombs and strafing runs ignite fuel, ammunition, cargo. Damage spreads rapidly. Crews attempt to fight fires, but with limited equipment and little coordinated training, chaos overtakes effort. Ships sink quickly. American analysts note the pattern. Japanese ships often go down fast, not because they are hit harder, but because damage propagates unchecked. Takeda begins compiling unofficial notes, comparisons drawn from after-action reports, survivor accounts, intelligence intercepts. He notices the same phrases repeating. Fire spread rapidly. Flooding could not be contained. Loss of power led to loss of control. None of these describe a single fatal blow. They describe collapse. At a closed briefing, Takeda voices his concern again. "Our ships are dying," he says, choosing his words carefully. "Not from the first wound, but from the second and third." An older admiral frowns. "You are suggesting we should fight to save ships rather than win battles?" Takeda bows slightly. "I am suggesting that winning battles requires ships that survive being hit." The room is silent. The implication is uncomfortable. Meanwhile, American doctrine continues to evolve. Damage control is no longer just reactive. It is planned into tactics. Ships fight assuming they will be hit. Redundancy is built into systems. Crews rotate through drills that simulate worst-case scenarios, multiple fires, flooding, casualties, power loss, all at once. To Japanese planners watching from afar, it looks excessive, almost paranoid, until it starts deciding battles. By mid-1943, Japanese naval losses accelerate in ways that defy traditional explanations. Ships that should survive limp engagements instead vanish hours later. Survivors report the same story again and again. Small fires becoming large ones, minor flooding becoming uncontrollable, confusion replacing command. Takeda writes in his private journal, "We fight as if the battle ends when the guns fall silent. The Americans fight as if the battle begins then." He knows the truth now. But knowing it is not the same as changing it. And time the Americans are buying with every damaged but floating ship, is something Japan no longer has. June 4th, 1942, north of Midway Atoll. Commander Masao Kato, Imperial Japanese Navy, stands amid smoke and steam on the hangar deck of the carrier Akagi. The air is thick with fuel vapor, hot metal, and the sharp tang of burning insulation. Men shout orders that overlap and contradict each other. Somewhere below, pumps whine uselessly against rising water. Minutes earlier, Akagi had been the spear point of Japan's naval power. Fast, disciplined, invincible in reputation, if not in fact. Now she is wounded, not shattered, not sinking. Wounded. An American dive bomber's bomb has punched through the flight deck and detonated among armed and fueled aircraft below. The explosion itself did not kill the ship. What follows might. Fuel lines rupture. Gasoline spreads across the hangar deck in shimmering pools. Fires ignite almost instantly. Heat builds faster than the crew can respond. Kato watches sailors attack flames with hoses and extinguishers. But there is no practiced flow, no rehearsed choreography. Some compartments are sealed. Others are left open in the confusion. Smoke spreads through ventilation shafts. Communications fail. Someone yells that the fire is contained. It isn't. On the American side of the Pacific, less than a year earlier, USS Yorktown had taken 3 bomb hits at Coral Sea. She was dead in the water, listing, burning. Any reasonable observer would have written her off. Instead, American damage control teams swarmed the ship. They shored bulkheads, rerouted power, counter-flooded to correct the list. Fires were isolated, then suffocated. Within hours, Yorktown was making way again, enough to fight at Midway. She would eventually be lost to submarines, but not before she helped decide the battle. Back aboard Akagi, the lack of such a system becomes fatal. Firefighting equipment is insufficient for fuel-fed blazes of this scale. Damage control lockers are scattered and inconsistently stocked. Most critically, the crew has never trained to fight multiple cascading failures at once. Each team fights its own battle. No one fights the ships. Kato realizes this with a sinking certainty as the list increases and the fires roar unchecked. Ammunition begins to cook off. The hangar deck becomes a furnace. Orders come down to abandon ship. The carrier is still afloat, but she is already lost. Nearby, the carriers Kaga and Soryu suffer similar fates. Each is struck by a small number of bombs. Each succumbs rapidly afterward. Japanese planners will later argue that Midway was decided by surprise, by luck, by timing. Those factors mattered, but beneath them lay something more fundamental. When Japanese carriers were hit, damage spread faster than it could be controlled. When American carriers were hit, damage was fought, systematically, relentlessly, by design. Kato survives the sinking of Akagi. Months later, recovering from burns, he reads intelligence summaries describing American ships surviving hits that would have doomed Japanese vessels. Destroyers with half their superstructure gone. Cruisers gutted by explosions yet still afloat. He recognizes the pattern immediately. The Americans are not luckier. They are better prepared for failure. 1943-1944, the Central Pacific. As the war grinds on, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. At Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, American ships absorb punishment during amphibious assaults. Coastal batteries scoring hits, kamikaze precursors slamming into hulls, near misses rupturing seams. Ships burn, ships flood, ships stay afloat. Damage control teams operate almost independently of command, empowered to act without waiting for permission. Training has given them authority and confidence. They seal compartments, even if it means trapping equipment or men on the other side. The ship comes first, always. Japanese ships face the same dangers, but when they are hit, they die faster. A single torpedo cripples a cruiser. A bomb ignites forces that rage unchecked. Electrical systems fail without redundancy. Flooding spreads because compartments are not sealed in time, or cannot be sealed at all. Crews fight bravely. But bravery cannot substitute for organization. By June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the imbalance is glaring. American carriers take hits and continue flight operations within hours. Japanese carriers, struck far less decisively, are abandoned as fires spread uncontrollably. A Japanese officer later writes, "Our ships burned as if made of paper. The enemy's burned as if wrapped in discipline." Captain Takeda reads these accounts with grim clarity. The Americans have turned damage control into a weapon, not one that kills enemy ships directly, but one that keeps their own ships alive long enough to keep killing. Every American vessel that survives another hour drains Japanese resources further. More planes lost, more pilots killed, more fuel burned. Attrition accelerates, and Japan cannot replace what it loses. Takeda submits a final memo, quietly circulated, never officially acknowledged. We believed the battle ended when shells stopped striking. We were wrong. The enemy fights hardest after the hit. The memo changes nothing. There is no time. For men like Kato, the realization arrives too late. Standing on a survivor transport months after Midway, watching another damaged Japanese ship sink with alarming speed, he finally understands what American sailors had been trained to know from the beginning. Ships do not sink because they are hit. They sink because the crew cannot stop what the hit begins. And in this war, the Americans have learned how to stop it. October 24th, 1944. Later Gulf. Captain Hiroshi Takeda stands on the bridge wing of the heavy cruiser Chokai as the first reports come in. The sea is choppy, the sky low and grey, the air thick with anticipation. This is it, the decisive battle Japanese naval planners have waited for. A final chance to break American sea power and turn the tide. Takeda grips the railing as lookout reports crackle through the voice tubes. Enemy aircraft, multiple bearings. Moments later, the sky erupts. American carrier aircraft descend in waves, precise and relentless. Bombs splash close aboard. Torpedoes streak through the water, white wakes cutting toward the hull. Chokai shudders as a near miss ruptures plates below the waterline. Another explosion tears through the upper works. Fire breaks out amidships. Takeda orders damage control immediately. Men move. Hoses are run. Compartments are sealed, some too late, others not at all. The ship begins to list. It is not the severity of the damage that alarms him. It is how fast it spreads. Across the Gulf, American ships are experiencing the same storm. Destroyers are hit by bombs that rip through decks. Carriers take kamikaze strikes that explode fuel and shrapnel across flight decks. Cruisers are rocked by torpedoes that open their hulls like tin cans, yet again and again they remain afloat. Damage control teams flood the decks within seconds. Fires are boxed in, oxygen starved, boundaries set. Electrical power is rerouted almost instinctively. Men work with faces blackened, hands bleeding, lungs burning. But the pattern never breaks. Hit, isolate, fight, recover. On Chokai, Takeda realizes the truth in fragments. Firefighting parties lack breathing apparatus for prolonged smoke exposure. Communications between compartments collapse as cables burn through. Flooding spreads through interconnected spaces that were never meant to be sealed independently. The ship was designed to fight the enemy, not to fight itself. As fires rage and list increases, Takeda orders counter-flooding, but the response is slow, hesitant. The crew has practiced gunnery drills endlessly, damage control drills rarely, if at all. The list worsens, speed drops, the cruiser falls out of formation. That is when the next strike finds her. By mid-afternoon, Chokai is dead in the water, still afloat, still burning, still technically salvageable, but beyond saving. Takeda gives the order to abandon ship. As he steps into the sea, watching the cruiser that once embodied Japanese naval pride begin her final role, he understands something that has nothing to do with tactics or courage. This ship is dying because the war demanded something she was never built or trained to provide: endurance. After later Gulf, the pattern becomes undeniable. Japanese ships do not merely lose battles, they vanish. American ships lose pieces of themselves and keep fighting. The difference is no longer anecdotal, it is statistical. US Navy analysts track it carefully. They notice that American ships absorb 2 sometimes 3 times as much damage per engagement before sinking. That survival rates for crews remain high even when ships are lost. That damaged vessels are often repaired and returned to service. Japanese ships, by contrast, are written off almost immediately after major hits. Survivors are fewer. Salvage is rare. Repair timelines stretch beyond feasibility. One American officer summarizes it bluntly. "We assume we'll be hit. They assume they won't." Japanese naval planners begin revisiting old assumptions. Too late. They had believed decisive battles would be short, that superior weapons and spirit would decide outcomes before endurance mattered, that a ship's job was to strike, not to absorb punishment. American planners believed the opposite, that every ship would be hit, that survival after impact was the true measure of combat power. So they trained for it, obsessively. From the moment a sailor boarded a U.S. Navy ship, damage control was drilled into him. Not as an afterthought, but as a core skill. Every man knew where the shoring timber was stored, which valves to close, which compartments mattered most. Every sailor was a firefighter. Every sailor was a repairman. Every sailor was, in a sense, part of the ship's immune system. In Japan, hierarchy and specialization worked against such a culture. Damage control was someone else's responsibility. Decisions waited for orders. Initiative was constrained by doctrine and deference. When chaos arrived, as it always does in battle, there was no framework to contain it. Fire spread. Flooding cascaded. Panic followed. By early 1945, the consequences are terminal. Japanese surface forces are shadows of their former selves. Ships are sunk faster than they can be replaced. Crews die not because they lack courage, but because their ships give them no time. American forces advance relentlessly, shielded by fleets that refuse to die easily. A destroyer takes a kamikaze hit and sails again within days. A carrier burns for hours, then resumes flight operations. Each survival compounds the imbalance. Captain Takeda, recovering from wounds sustained at Leyte, writes one final private reflection before the war ends. "We prepared for victory. They prepared for damage. In the end, damage was inevitable." He does not send it. There is no one left who needs convincing. The mockery that once flowed from Japanese planners, the quiet disdain for American emphasis on safety drills, redundancy, compartmentalization, has evaporated. Those unheroic practices have decided the war at sea, not in single moments of brilliance, but in the brutal arithmetic of survival. April 6, 1945, off Okinawa. The sea is crowded again. American ships ring the invasion fleet in overlapping circles, radar antennas sweeping, guns elevated, damage control parties already at their stations before the first enemy aircraft appears. Everyone knows what is coming. Kamikazes. Lieutenant Commander William Bill Harrington, damage control officer aboard the carrier USS Bunker Hill, stands below decks near Damage Control Central. He can feel the tension in the steel beneath his boots, an almost living anticipation. Then the alarms scream. 2 Japanese aircraft break through the outer defenses almost simultaneously. The impacts are catastrophic. One plane slams into the flight deck, its bomb detonating amid fueled aircraft. Seconds later, another strikes nearby, ripping open compartments and turning the hangar deck into an inferno. The ship lurches. Fire roars. Men are thrown against bulkheads. For a moment it looks fatal. Harrington doesn't wait for orders. He never does. "Boundary set," he shouts. "Ventilation secured. Foam teams forward." The ship responds. Hatches slam shut. Fire mains come alive. Men drag hoses through smoke so thick it feels solid. Electrical crews reroute power around shattered circuits. Flooding parties counterflood without hesitation, accepting list to preserve stability. The training takes over. No one debates. No one freezes. They act because they have done this before. Dozens of times, in drills that once felt excessive, even absurd. The fires rage for hours. Hundreds are killed or wounded. But Bunker Hill does not sink. By nightfall, the fires are under control. By morning, she is still afloat. By war's end, she will return to port under her own power. Across the water, Japanese attacks achieve devastating hits, but still fail to break the fleet. Ships burn. Ships flood. Ships survive. Again and again. The kamikaze strategy, born in part because conventional attacks could no longer penetrate American defenses, runs headlong into the same reality that doomed Japan's surface fleet. Damage control. A pilot can destroy a section of a ship. He cannot destroy the system that keeps it alive. Japanese planners finally understand, with crushing clarity, what went wrong. It was never just about weapons, or bravery, or even numbers. It was about assumptions. Japan assumed war would be decided by decisive blows. America assumed war would be decided by what happened after the blow landed. So American ships were built with redundancy layered atop redundancy. Power systems that could be isolated, fire mains that could be rerouted, compartments that could be sacrificed to save the whole, and crews trained endlessly to use them. Japanese ships, by contrast, often concentrated systems for efficiency and speed. Fire control, electrical distribution, ventilation, optimized for performance, not resilience. They were faster, sleeker, deadlier on paper, and catastrophically fragile once damaged. After the war, U.S. Navy investigators tour wrecks across the Pacific. They find Japanese ships sunk with damage that American vessels would likely have survived. Burned-out compartments left unsealed, flooded spaces uncounted, fire boundaries never established. The ships did not lack bravery. They lacked time that American crews had learned how to buy. In post-war interviews, surviving Japanese officers speak candidly. One former destroyer captain admits, "We believed damage control was secondary, something to consider after battle. The Americans treated it as part of fighting itself." Another says quietly, "We thought they were cautious. Now I see they were prepared." The U.S. Navy absorbs the lesson just as deeply. Damage control training does not relax after victory. It intensifies. What worked under bombs and kamikazes becomes doctrine for the Cold War, for nuclear weapons, for missiles that would make World War II damage look trivial by comparison. The philosophy hardens into something permanent. Ships will be hit. Survival is a skill. Years later, Harrington will stand on a modern carrier, watching young sailors drill, securing hatches, rigging shoring, fighting simulated fires under blinding smoke. They complain. They always do, and he always smiles, because he knows what those drills really are. They are the difference between a ship that fights once and a ship that keeps fighting. The Japanese Navy did not lose because its sailors lacked courage. They lost because courage alone cannot keep a ship afloat. American sailors trusted their damage control because it worked, again and again, under the worst conditions imaginable. And in the end, Steele remembered that trust, while others sank faster than they ever expected.